For decades, Americans were told that if they just ate less fat, counted calories, and followed the food pyramid, we'd get healthier. Instead, we got an obesity epidemic, exploding rates of type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease in children, and nearly 90% of healthcare spending going toward chronic disease. That didn't happen by accident. It happened under the very dietary guidelines that were supposed to protect public health. So when the 2025-2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans say this represents the most significant reset of federal nutrition policy in our nation's history, that's not hyperbole. Today, I want to walk you through what these new guidelines actually say, how they differ from the previous versions, and why many of these changes are overdue. Because these guidelines influence what millions of Americans eat every day, whether they realize it or not. The most important change is not a macronutrient target, it's philosophical. Previous guidelines were obsessed with percentages, daily values, and abstract nutrient math. This version centers around one idea: eat real food. That phrase appears repeatedly and intentionally. Chronic disease is not genetic destiny. The standard American diet is largely responsible. Highly processed foods are the core problem. This is the first time federal guidelines have so directly acknowledged that policy-driven nutrition advice helped create this crisis. Older guidelines often used vague language like moderate, limit, balance. This version names the problem. That alone is a profound shift. Let's talk about protein, because this is arguably the most clinically relevant update. The new guidelines recommend 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Protein at every meal, a wide variety of sources including eggs, red meat, poultry, seafood, and full-fat dairy. This is not accidental. Protein affects muscle mass, insulin sensitivity, satiety, bone density, aging, recovery, metabolic rate, and yet previous guidelines treated protein as something you just needed to meet the minimum for. They emphasized lean protein, plant-forward messaging, avoidance of red meat, but what they ignored was physiology. As we age, we become less sensitive to protein. We need more protein per meal to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Muscle loss accelerates metabolic decline. These new guidelines quietly acknowledge that reality, and that's a big deal. This aligns far more closely with geriatric medicine, sports medicine, obesity medicine, and real-world clinical outcomes. Another notable shift is that full-fat dairy is explicitly recommended. Let that sink in. For decades, whole milk was demonized, butter was framed as dangerous, saturated fat was treated as a dietary villain. Now, the guidelines say full-fat dairy is an excellent source of protein, fats, and micronutrients. Butter and beef tallow are acceptable cooking fats. Olive oil is preferred but not exclusive. They still keep the saturated fat limit under 10% of calories, but here's the important part. They acknowledge that highly processed foods, not whole foods, are the real driver of excess saturated fat intake. That's a critical distinction. Butter in a home-cooked meal is not the same thing as saturated fat embedded in ultra-processed junk food. And for the first time, the guidelines openly admit that more high-quality research is needed to determine which dietary fats best support long-term health. That level of humility has been missing for decades. Nutritional science is constantly evolving, and it's far from quote-unquote settled science. Now, this may be the most overdue correction. The new guidelines now explicitly discourage refined carbohydrates. They call out packaged foods by category and state that no amount of added sugar is recommended. They set per meal sugar limits, not just daily percentages. That's a huge departure from prior versions, which often allowed up to 10% of calories from added sugar. Regular inclusion of refined grains under balanced diets. And the reason this matters physiologically is that refined carbohydrates spike glucose rapidly, drive insulin secretion, promote fat storage, and disrupt appetite regulation. This is especially damaging in insulin-resistant individuals, adolescents, people with sedentary lifestyles, and by explicitly targeting ultra-processed foods, the guidelines finally align with decades of metabolic research. This isn't about carbs versus fat. It's about processing and metabolic load. That distinction is critical and long overdue. The new guidelines are also far more practical for real humans. In infants and children, they encourage early allergen introduction, promote nutrient-dense first foods, explicitly avoid added sugars, and emphasize full-fat dairy for brain development. In adolescence, there's an increased focus on protein, calcium, and iron, strong discouragement of sugary drinks and energy drinks, and recognition of rapid growth demands. In adults with chronic disease, this is huge. Individuals with certain chronic diseases may experience improved health outcomes when following a lower carbohydrate diet. That sentence would not have survived previous guideline committees. This acknowledges metabolic heterogeneity, individualized nutrition, and the legitimacy of lower carb approaches. That's a quiet revolution. These guidelines don't just affect nutrition nerds. They shape school lunches, hospital menus, military rations, insurance wellness programs, and public perception of health. For the first time in decades, federal nutrition policy is moving towards physiology instead of ideology. Is it perfect? No. Is it better? Absolutely. And if future guidelines continue down this path, emphasizing protein, metabolic health, real food, and individualization, we may finally start reversing the damage of the last 40 years. If this helped you understand what actually changed, give this video a like and let me know. How do you think these guidelines compare to the previous version? I'll see you on the next one.